Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us at this special time. We've made it a little bit earlier than usual to accommodate our speaker who's in Asia. This is the Society for Conservation Biology's Impact Evaluation Working Group seminar, which is called Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. So my name is Alan Blackman. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, and along with Julia Jones at Bangor University, we are tag team hosting the seminar this fall and spring. We do these introductions and provide some other limited input, but the real work is done by three board members. Elias Cisneros at the University of Texas at Dallas, who usually hosts our Q&A, Renzo Guiducci, and Alex Caruana, who are our webinar coordinators. Just a quick announcement, we have 4 new board members, and our new board member for community engagement is Prahlad Burley at the Keystone Foundation. For research briefings, our new board member is Claire Vincent at La Sapienza University of Rome. Secretary and volunteer engagement lead is Ellie Roxborough at River Action in the United Kingdom, and our conference and events lead is, sorry, my screen is obscured, Malavika Narayana at the Himalayan Initiative in India. Some quick background on our working group. It's one of the newer working groups of the Society of Conservation Biology. The goal is to The goal is to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts across the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. You can find out all about the working group at our website, which I'll show you in just a second. And you can also engage with us on social media on X and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. So the website is a tremendous resource. So it is, I think the URL is at the bottom, scb-impact.org. And among other things, it has a repository of recordings of all of our past seminars, which is an amazing resource, and I highly recommend that you check it out. If you're interested in getting involved in the working group, we very much encourage you to do that, and you can find out how to do that at the website. Last month in November, we had a great seminar by Nick Zalafsky, who's the director at Foundations of Success, and he was talking about gold standard versus aluminum standard impact assessments in conservation practice. Today, we're very happy to have with us Hollie Booth, who I'll introduce in just a second. And Hollie's going to be talking about conservation impacts, hidden actions, and insights for adaptive management from an RCT of a marine pay-to-release program. A little bit of housekeeping. So Hollie's going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we will have 20 minutes for a Q&A. So if you have a question, we very much encourage you to ask questions and to just type it into the chat. There's going to be a live transcription. And as I said, the seminar is going to be recorded and it'll be available on our website. You can also engage with us on social media using hashtag Tuesdays at Team Counterfactual with the tag at IDO Impact. So a little bit about Hollie. She's a biologist whose research focuses on the links between conservation and human well-being. She works a lot on shark and ray conservation. She's got 3 positions. She's a research fellow at Bangor University. She's also a postdoc at the University of Oxford Department of Biology, and she's co-founder and director of a local NGO in Indonesia, the name of which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but Hollie tells me the meaning is Togetherness for the Ocean, and the acronym is KUL. She's worked before at Biodiversity Consultancy Limited and at the Wildlife Conservation Society. She's published extensively in interdisciplinary and top conservation biology journals, including, for example, Nature Sustainability, Science Advances, Biological Conservation, Conservation Letters, and the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. Her PhD is in biology from the University of Oxford, and she's got a master's in conservation science from the Imperial College in London. So we're so happy to have you with us, Hollie. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Hope everybody can see that. Perfect. So yeah, thanks again for having me. And as Alan already said, my name's Hollie, and I'm here to talk to you about our recent randomized controlled trial of a page release program for reducing fishing mortality of critically endangered sharks and rays in small-scale fisheries in Indonesia. But before I dive into the specifics of the program, I wanted to spend a few minutes on sort of the bigger picture, because in my view, this RCT is kind of just a case study for thinking about some wider issues and aspirations. So my work in general bridges research, policy, and practice, ultimately seeking to answer the overarching question: how can we deliver positive outcomes for biodiversity and people? This is what I'm really interested in, and this is kind of the question that keeps me up at night and keeps me going and keeps me motivated in conservation. And I have a hypothesis that incentives are part of the solution. And the reason is, since human actions drive biodiversity loss, realizing a nature and people positive future will require substantial and sustained changes to human behavior, such that we can balance essential human needs and planetary boundaries within a safe and just operating space. And so that's here inside this green donut, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Yet most of the necessary behavioral changes entail trade-offs between economic development or economic goals and biodiversity conservation. And we're currently in a situation where we have some very wealthy individuals, organizations, and countries who are operating way here outside of the donut out here. Their activities cause massive environmental footprints and biodiversity loss through huge levels of production and consumption, taking us way beyond a safe ecological ceiling, while we have some people who can't meet their basic daily needs. Okay, so essentially, what I was saying is that incentives could play an important role in bringing about the changes that we need to see, because they offer an efficient means for encouraging pro-environmental behaviour, whilst also supporting economic welfare. And if they're well designed, they can promote distributive justice as well. However, conservation incentives are not unambiguously positive, otherwise we would all already be using them. They can change human behaviour in unforeseen ways, which might undermine biodiversity outcomes. So we can have situations of hidden information, also known as adverse selection. When some resource users already engage in conservation action, incentive payments might go to users who would have done the pro-conservation behaviour anyway, so we have a lack of additionality. You can also have hidden actions, also known as moral hazard, which is when resource users might change their behaviours in ways that are unobservable to practitioners or people offering payments at the expense of conservation goals. We can have release of budget constraints, which is when incentive payments might relax budget constraints that then enable greater levels of exploitation. So resource users might go and buy new boats or more powerful equipment for hunting wildlife, for example. And we can have spillovers where payments focused on one part of a complex socio-ecological system can cause unforeseen knock-on effects on other non-target ecosystems or species. And we can have all of these things that can potentially interact with each other and exacerbate each other as well. And so this is why incentive programs, while they might hypothetically be effective, need to be empirically evaluated with estimation of counterfactual behaviour. That is what would have happened in the absence of the incentive. However, these are incredibly rare, and experimental evaluations of incentive programs are incredibly rare in conservation. And one reason is that they're basically particularly challenging because we have these coupled human natural systems with complex interactions and trade-offs between the social and environmental components. So Within this context, we conducted the world's first pre-registered randomized controlled trial of an incentive-based marine conservation program, which aimed to reduce fishing mortality of critically endangered species in small-scale fisheries, whilst also ensuring fisher households were no worse off. So why sharks and why Indonesia? Well, sharks and rays are amongst the world's most threatened vertebrate taxa. Around 1 in 3 shark species are threatened with extinction, and this is primarily due to overfishing. Sometimes they're targeted for their high-value fins and meat, but more often than not, they're caught incidentally in nets and lines that are primarily targeting other types of fish. And Indonesia is a global hotspot of shark species diversity and endemicity, where many people come from all over the world to scuba dive with sharks and rays. But it's also a hotspot of fishing pressure. And in fact, Indonesia catches more sharks and rays than any other country in the world. Sometimes they're specifically targeted to sell high-value fins for the international fin trade. However, tackling overfishing of sharks and rays is particularly challenging in small-scale fisheries. So around 90% of Indonesia's fleet is small-scale, and many sharks and rays are caught in these fisheries either as targeted catch or as valuable secondary catch. And in these situations, households rely on marine resources, and they use pretty much everything they catch, including threatened sharks and rays, either as a direct source of animal protein. So this picture on the right is shark meat skewers, or to sell for money to feed their families and send their kids to school. And so this means we face difficult trade-offs between marine conservation and coastal livelihoods. On the one hand, we want to protect sharks and rays for their intrinsic and tourism values, but this goal is often at odds with the material well-being of coastal communities, at least in the short term. And even though it's often said that sharks and rays are worth more alive because of the high-value dive tourism industry, most small-scale fishing communities are not well placed to benefit from the tourism industry. And at the same time, large-scale industrial activities such as commercial fisheries can cause huge amounts of damage, and yet these wealthy and powerful stakeholders are rarely held accountable for the damage that they cause. So basically, if we ask coastal communities to protect sharks and rays by reducing their catches, what's in it for them? What about the income they would lose? And why should they be the ones that have to bear the cost of conservation? So in this context, the specific question is, can conditional positive incentives deliver biodiversity and well-being outcomes in small-scale fisheries? Now, this question is relevant for many coastal areas and marine species in Indonesia and worldwide. But we focused on 2 case study locations and on 2 critically endangered species. So Aceh Jaya in Aceh province, where hundreds of juvenile wedgefish and hammerheads are frequently caught in gillnet fisheries that are typically targeting reef fish all along the southwest coastline. And here we had 3 study villages. And East Lombok in West Nusa Tenggara province, which is home to a kind of infamous targeted shark fishery, where they use long lines to catch large-bodied adult sharks. Silky sharks are actually the main catch, but hammerheads and wedgefish account for about 7% and 2% of total catch, respectively. And here we had 2 study villages. And I've been conducting research in these 2 locations for around 6 years now, since my PhD, basically trying to understand the underlying social and economic drivers of fisher behaviour relating to shark catches, co-design solutions together with fishers, and understand how fishers might respond to different types of interventions and incentives, and then test if they really work. And all of this research led to and informed the design of our incentive program. So to give you a super quick summary of the key points, we basically found that even though fishers often say endangered sharks are just bycatch, wedgefish and hammerhead catches have economic and subsistence value like any other fish. So fishers often refer to them as rezeki laut, or God's gift from the ocean. And this means that any measures to reduce catches will create opportunity costs for fishers in terms of reduced food and income. However, positive incentives or compensation for conservation were widely supported by fishers because they can ganti rugi, or make up for the loss, and could hypothetically be a cost-effective and fair approach to drive pro-conservation behaviour. And based on this research, we designed a pay-to-release scheme and established voluntary agreements to compensate fishers if they safely release wedgefish and hammerheads, with payments conditional on submission of live release videos taken on waterproof cameras that we provided. So to explicitly explain our conservation hypothesis, the business as usual situation is one in which the hammerheads and wedgefish hang out where the other valuable fish hang out, and they're susceptible to capture in the fishing gears that fishers use, and fishers have no reason to try to avoid them. So this means that hammerheads and wedgefish inevitably get caught. They're also valuable, and it's illegal to trade them domestically, so they're retained and then they die. And due to cumulative fishing pressure and slow life history traits, overfishing occurs and populations are declining. Our pay-to-release program works at the point of retention by incentivizing fishers to safely release hammerheads and wedgefish from their nets and lines after they've become entangled, thus reducing fishing mortality and helping populations to stabilize and recover. But the program's impacts are not unambiguously positive. The incentive can also cause countervailing negative behaviours, as explained right at the start of the session. So, for example, fishers could increase their shark-relevant fishing effort to catch and release more sharks to receive more payments at the expense of our conservation goals. And so this ambiguity means that to know the true impact of the programme, we need to estimate the counterfactual behaviour, which is where experimentation comes in. So we implemented the program as a randomized controlled trial. The eligible vessels in Aceh Jaya and East Lombok were randomly split into two groups. One group was eligible to receive compensation for releases, and the other continued to fish as usual with no payments, acting as a control group. We collected data on conservation relevant actions, so that's the live releases, biodiversity outcomes, which were measured as per retained catches, which is a good proxy for fishing mortality, via daily landings monitoring. So we had somebody at the harbour every day recording which sharks and how many were retained at the landing site. And we collected data on wellbeing outcomes via periodic interview administered surveys for both groups and compared them. And finally, we did this using a crossover design, meaning that at some point, the treatment group became the control group and the control group became the treatment group. And this was basically to improve fairness so that everyone has the opportunity to participate. So what happened? So during the study period, over 1,200 hammerheads and wedgefish were safely released by fishers in the program. I put a little star next to that number because it's actually been more since, because we've continued the program and continued the RCT, but this was the amount that were released during the study period that's in the published paper. And if we just ignore the experiment for a minute and pretend we didn't run it as an RCT and we just kind of did conventional monitoring like most conservation programs, and compare releases versus retained catches amongst vessels in the treatment condition, this suggests a huge success. We have a 71% reduction in wedgefish mortality and a 4% reduction in hammerhead mortality. And fishers and their families also reported positive attitudes towards the program and maintained or improved well-being during the program. So this seems like a huge win-win. Unfortunately, not. So if we look at the experimental results and we compare retained catches in the treatment versus control condition, we can see that the incentives also induced some unintended negative behavioural change. So wedgefish mortality was actually only 25% lower in the treatment condition relative to the control condition. This is still a positive conservation impact, but somewhat lower than 71%. And shockingly, hammerhead mortality was 44% higher in the treatment condition relative to the control condition. Moreover, both of these estimates are significantly different from the conventional estimate that we got from comparing releases with retained catches in the treatment condition. And so this is our indication that one or more of the sort of countervailing behaviours are taking place. And basically, further investigation suggested hidden action or moral hazard. So some fishers were purposefully increasing their catches of wedgefish to receive more payment. And this then caused negative spillovers for hammerheads. So hammerheads co-occur with wedgefish, but they're harder to safely release because they have much higher post-capture mortality. And fishers knew they wouldn't receive payments if the sharks were dead. The videos have to show the sharks swimming away safely. So more wedgefish were caught and then released, but more hammerheads were also caught but couldn't be released and died. So we got higher wedgefish mortality. Interestingly, though, these are sort of average treatment effects, but if we break down the results by study location, we do see some evidence of quite different responses across locations. So, in East Lombok, there was basically no effect. We only had 2 live releases reported during the whole study period, and you can see that if we add up total retained catches in the control condition and total retained catches plus releases in the treatment condition and compare the two in absolute terms, they're basically the same in these 2 villages. And when we asked fishers why they didn't participate, they said the sharks were usually dead or the compensation wasn't high enough, even though they'd said in the design phase that they would participate and the compensation we were offering was enough. In contrast, you can see for Kelawang village in Aceh Jaya, there is this huge perverse effect where the at-vessel catches of wedgefish in the treatment condition are way higher than those for the control condition, but most were released. So obviously, these weren't the kind of conservation impacts or conservation outcomes we were hoping for from a sort of practitioner perspective, but that is science. And since it's rare to get anything perfectly right first time, we haven't given up. We've just used these results to make some changes. So, firstly, we've made some adjustments to the incentive structure, including implementing size-based pricing to ensure that the compensation value for small individuals was not above market rates. So we'd previously just been offering a flat rate payment for all individuals in Aceh, just for simplicity. And we think this might have caused fishers, especially in Kelawang village, to catch more small ones in order to release them, because the flat rate price was probably slightly above market rate for small wedgefish. We also now have the compensation price per individual declining as the total number of releases in a given period increases to mitigate against the perverse incentives to just catch and release as many as possible. We've also been piloting a new gear swap program in which fishers in Aceh Jaya trade their gill nets for fish traps, which avoid shark bycatch in the first place. And it's still early days and we only have a really small number of vessels in this program, but preliminary results have been really positive, with so far 100% reduction in catches of critically endangered species in the fish traps relative to gill nets and stable income per trip. So this is really promising, but at the same time, we're not necessarily thinking that we're going to be able to switch every single gillnet fisher to boo-boo traps, because that could also have perverse unintended consequences on, for example, overfishing snapper and grouper, which are the fish caught in these traps, or causing issues of sort of ghost nets and too many traps floating around in the water. So yeah, still thinking about a kind of a wider integrated approach. And the journey continues. So we're continuing to run our adapted and new programs as randomized control trials so that we can robustly measure impacts. And we're looking to sustain and scale up successful models and approaches as well. So this includes things like improving the marginal effectiveness of our specific intervention and scaling out to reach more people and places, as well as working with other NGOs in Indonesia to apply a similar process to the one I've presented today, for designing and evaluating their own locally appropriate incentive-based programs in new contexts. We're also thinking about how to sustain and embed new norms and values. In some instances, positive behavioural changes are likely to revert once the economic incentives are removed. But in other cases, we're seeing some potential signs of crowding in, with some fishers, for example, releasing other sharks voluntarily for which they're not paid. And we're sort of seeing fishers like interact with sharks in new ways that they never would have before. Like some of the videos are really funny and cute where they're like saying like, "Dada, bro, selamat jalan," which is like, "See you later, bro, safe journey." And to support sustaining and scaling, we're looking at how incentives can be integrated into policy frameworks or facilitate compliance with existing policies and funded in the long run, for example, by companies with ocean-related impact and dependencies, and as part of efforts to hold them accountable for their marine impacts and dependencies. And I'm not going to go into the details here, as this is kind of going beyond the sort of impact evaluation piece, but our research has shown that both polluter pays and beneficiary pays schemes, such as bycatch taxes or tourism levies, both offer potential opportunities to fund community-based incentive programs whilst holding wealthier and more powerful marine stakeholders accountable for their ocean impacts and dependencies, and facilitating wealth redistribution. So, to summarize, these results offer valuable insights into how incentive programs and conservation programs in general can be more effectively designed and evaluated. Firstly, there's not really any definitive evidence on whether incentives do or do not work for marine conservation. It's going to be one of those annoying ones where it's just, it depends. We've shown that incentives can rapidly change conservation relevant behaviours, but that we need to get the incentive structures right to fit each context and to deliver the desired outcome. We've also demonstrated the complexity of designing incentive-based conservation programs. Human behaviour is complex and dynamic, and conservation can sometimes feel like whack-a-mole. And even the most careful efforts to predictively design conservation programs together with fishers like ours could not account for all types of real-world uncertainties and complexities. Even though fishers said they would behave and respond in a certain way, when the incentives were offered, the actual situation was different. And this really underlines the importance of piloting incentive programs and conservation programs in general, using experimental designs before scaling, as well as the value of pragmatic experimentation and a culture of continuous learning. So if we hadn't done an RCT and we just relied on the numbers of releases as our indicator of success, we would never have known about these unintended consequences. And it kind of scares me to think how many conservation programs out there could be doing the same thing and just not know. And in many ways, I understand that RCTs can be challenging, but I think it's kind of unethical not to experimentally evaluate in situations where impacts are ambiguous and experimentation is possible. It's also worth emphasizing that this was just the first study of its kind, and it only covered 87 vessels in 2 places in 1 country. And it's my dream to sort of replicate this over many more places and contexts, and to generate more externally valid and generalizable results, as well as explore the influence of different contextual variables on outcomes. And ultimately, there are no silver bullet solutions that are going to solve all conservation problems everywhere. So I think we need sort of shared outcome-based goals that we can all agree on, and then scaling of participatory processes and kind of customizable bundles of integrated policies and instruments to drive scalable and durable change. Ultimately, we have to have an open mind when it comes to thinking about potential solutions, but an empirical heart when it comes to figuring out if they really work. And I should also say, while I really do think we need to stop making excuses for not doing RCTs, I do also appreciate that they're not appropriate for every question. And as evidence, I have a few other impact evaluation papers out there, for example, using process tracing for policy impacts. Quite relevant at the moment, given a bunch of stuff that's been happening at the CITES COP. I don't know if anyone's been following that. And also statistical inference and quasi-experimental approaches where controls weren't possible. This is really just kind of a shameless plug to some of my other impact evaluation work that's out there. And finally, before I stop talking and we move to questions, I have to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been involved and supported me through this body of work. So I'm the one here talking, but there's been so many people involved, too many names to mention everybody. But of course, fishing communities, partner NGOs, students, research assistants, friends, supervisors, co-authors. I sort of remember becoming inspired by and obsessed with impact evaluation during my master's program in 2015. And EJ Melvigulland and Paul Ferraro were my academic idols. And if you told me then that 10 years on, I'd be presenting the results of my own RCT to the SCB Impact Evaluation Working Group, which I co-authored with EJ and Paul, it would have blown my mind. So I really do feel very lucky to be working on this and very grateful for the opportunity. And also grateful to all of the donors as well that have made this work possible. So thanks everyone for listening. And if you want to read any more, there's a couple of QR codes here. One that links to our Science Advances paper on this study. You can follow Kebersamaan Untuk Lautan on Instagram to watch heartwarming videos of sharks being released. And there's another QR code there that's just got a sort of summary of some of my PhD research as well. So thanks everybody, and happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Hollie. Alex, or who's handling the Q&A? Renzo, you're muted.
Yes. So I will start and then hand it to Alex, probably. It depends on the timing. And But let me just say, Holly, thank you again. And we are the lucky ones today by having you on our series, for sure. We have gotten already a few questions, and I have summarized them in at least two groups. One is about methods, methodologies, and and the other one is funding. Let's start with the methods, but everybody, please, if you have more questions, just drop them on the chat box, and let's start. So regarding, let me scroll back here, because these are actually from Paul Ferraro. Regarding the crossover design that you mentioned, what can you say about the advantages or disadvantages in general about the approach? And regarding the disadvantages specifically, what do you think could be the effect of having been a participant as a treated group and then moving on to the control group afterwards, and how could that affect your behavior in the experiment?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Paul. So I think the advantages are it meant that everybody could participate. So I think one of the big kind of critiques or reasons why people don't do RCTs is because it's sort of unethical to have some people who are treated and some people who never get to kind of participate or receive the benefits of the conservation program. But the crossover design means we can get around that by enabling everybody to participate. And in a way, we were kind of lucky with our program design because of the way that we're measuring outcomes, and the type of incentive structure sort of lent itself to a crossover design. You can't necessarily always do a crossover design depending on which behaviors and which outcomes you're measuring, but we could in this instance. And it also means that everybody at some point is their own control. So everybody is both treated and control group. So you're comparing data even across the same individuals, which can sometimes help with sort of the statistics of treatment versus control groups. So those are some of the benefits. Some of the challenges are basically stuff to do with, I guess, kind of like the warm glow effect or sort of spillovers between treatment and control groups. So hypothetically, you offer a payment for people to release the sharks. They do it initially for the money, but there's a crowding in of environmental norms. And they're like, great, I'm going to continue doing this behavior because it just feels nice and I'm happy to release the shark. And then they continue to do it when they're in the control group. We didn't see any evidence of that in our data, or at least not that it was having a huge effect. But that is something that could happen. It also was tricky, I think, because again we could switch the payments on and off, and we were pretty sure that as soon as you switch the payment off, the behavior would revert. We weren't too worried about the kind of the biodiversity outcome, but it did make it tricky when it came to trying to measure the well-being responses, because those were periodic surveys, it was subjective well-being, and we didn't have like a clean control group basically because we were switching people in and out. So I think there's a couple of the downsides. I hope that answers the whole question. Ultimately, I would say that like the pros outweigh the cons. As in some situations, people just wouldn't do an RCT because they're like, oh, it's not fair if not everyone gets to receive the treatment, or it might be like untenable with the community or the NGO partner if some people are not going to receive the treatment. And so in that case, I think it's worth doing the crossover design if it means you're going to be able to get the RCT done. Yeah, I think that's about
it. Great. And related to that, and in the case of the pros of the approach, do you think that helps, or how does it help in somehow counteract the usual low number of the sample?
Yeah, no, that's because again we only had 87 vessels, but it did mean then that all of those vessels at some point could participate rather than us just splitting it in half and only having half of those vessels in. So yeah, agreed. Especially when there's kind of small sample sizes.
Great. A general question on RCTs actually is why do you think they are only few of them in conservation science? Someone is asking that.
Oh man, I think it's a great question and one that I often ask myself. I think probably a few reasons people are scared of them because they can feel kind of methodologically complex. I think, I do just want to kind of reiterate to some degree because of our program, an RCT was like a little bit easier because we could collect data every day on landings and behavior was really sensitive to the incentive. But if you're measuring like forest loss, it is way more complicated to sort of detect changes and to figure out spillovers between treatment and control groups. So I think, the design can be quite tricky. Detecting change in a time frame that you need to detect change can be quite tricky. In those situations, you might need big sample sizes, and so it can be seen to be quite expensive. If I'm being very cynical, I think sometimes people just don't want to know the answer. I think they'd rather just have nice stories than go through all this headache of a very complicated experimental design only for it to tell them that their program's not working. Like there's definitely, I think, some like fear around failure and losing funding. So I think it's a combination of it seemed to be technically challenging and expensive, and sometimes people are disincentivized to know the answer.
Great. Regarding the implementation of the research itself, Fred van Dijk is asking whether the shark fisheries have their own association, like a local guild of shark fishers, and would incentives originating from such an organization be more effective and long-lasting? If there is no association, could one be created?
That's a great question. Thanks, Fred. So this is actually very interesting because I have this is kind of based on my observation. So we have these two different case study sites, one in Aceh and one in in East Lombok. And in Aceh, they have a customary fisheries management institution called the Panglima Laut, which means commander of the sea. And it's a sort of bottom-up customary management organization where at multiple levels you have a Panglima Laut for each lock, which is kind of basically a bay, and then there's a Panglima Laut for the district and the regency and the province as a whole. And they basically have to coordinate fishers and manage disputes and basically they help to organize fishers. And through the Panglima Laut, there is within Aceh kind of pre-existing norms towards cooperating towards fisheries management and conservation. And if you can work with the Panglima Laut and the Panglima Laut agrees, the Panglima Laut will kind of pass information on to the other fishers, and generally the other fishers kind of come along. And you can have customary laws under the Panglima Laut that are separate from government laws. And because of that, it's been incredibly easy to work in Aceh, and our program has been more effective in Aceh because we're able to work through this institution. So the implementing NGO is a local NGO, Kebersamaan Untuk Lautan, which is all local people apart from me. And we have an amazing local field team who are there in the field every day. They're from Aceh, they know the fishers. And so, they do all the kind of hard work and are very kind of closely embedded within the community. And they kind of make the magic happen. In East Lombok, it's completely different. There's no fisheries association. People are kind of, based on my research, people are very individualistic. They mainly just care about their families, making as much money as possible for their family, sending their kids to school, that kind of thing. And actually, lots of the fishers are not originally from East Lombok even. There's lots of fishers from all different parts of Indonesia. There's like Bajo, Bugis, people from Java who have kind of moved into the area. And there are no pre-existing norms when it comes to conservation. People don't really want to cooperate. They just care about money. And the program, didn't really work there. We only got 2 releases and it's much harder to affect change. So I think you're absolutely right, Fred. It's a great question, and definitely these local institutions and norms and how fishes are organised make a huge difference, in my opinion. And it'd be fascinating if we could get some, do some more similar studies in the context and actually kind of analyze, down as data points to kind of analyze whether is this really meaningful. But it would be cool to compare across contexts where there are and are not these kind of fisher organizations.
That's great, fascinating. That there was actually a question that I think it's related to that, because someone was asking what could explain the heterogeneous effects that you have found, and I'm sure that's related to that contextual scenario that you just explained. But if you want to add anything else, please just go ahead.
So I think there's a bit of that. So I think the difference broadly between Aceh and East Lombok, East Lombok, it kind of failed. In Aceh, it in some instances worked, in some instances worked too well. So that sort of explains that. I think within the fishes in Aceh, so kind of as part of the next stage, we're starting to collect more granular data on GPS tracking for some vessels to try to figure out if there's like shifts in fishing patterns. My hunch, my hypothesis, I have two. One is, so during the kind of interview and design stage, when we asked fishers, can you control the degree to which you catch these species at the particular times and places when you catch more or less of them? Generally speaking, fishers would be like, oh, it's just kind of random. They just come to the net. And it seems like there are very broad seasonal patterns. But fishers generally said, oh, it's kind of random and we can't really control it. I don't know if that's entirely true, or if some of them were just like, it's too complicated. I think there are some fishers that have specialized knowledge. I think there are some fishers that know specific places where there are particular aggregations. Like clearly some fishers, because when we compare kind of just fishing effort in broad terms, like a day spent fishing, there were no differences. So it didn't increase the amount of days they spent at sea, but it changed something else. Either maybe where they fished, or it could have been like more granular effort on, I don't know, the amount of hours they had their net down for, or the number of times they put their net down. So we don't really know, but it could be that some fishers have specialized knowledge and they just exploited that by going to catch more sharks. I also think, populations are always heterogeneous, right? Like people don't always respond in the same way to different things. I think some fishers are like totally open to conservation, happy to release the sharks, and they're like, cool, if you're going to compensate me so I don't have to lose out, like brilliant. And they don't want to exploit the system, and they're just happy to just go along with it. Whereas some fishers do want to exploit the system and want to try and get more money. There's always going to be some people that try and game the system. And so I think those are my thoughts on the differences, really. But again, like it'd be great if we had a bigger data set, and we are doing a bit more of this now to try and actually statistically analyze, what are the kind of conditional average treatment effects and what drives good and bad responses and that kind of thing.
That's great. I'm sure there will be many people trying to follow up on your work for sure. Again, related to implementation, Lorenzo Glave is asking, how do fishermen prove their releases to project management? I understood you have cameras, but how can you be sure that they are really releasing, or the number of sharks being released?
Yes, so we give them waterproof cameras. It's one camera per vessel, and they have to take the videos on the cameras that we provided, and they're kind of time and date stamped. We have, as I say, we have teams in the field, and they go every week. They go around and check the videos, collect the videos. If a shark is clearly dead, or if it's not clear that it's been safe to release, the fishers just don't get paid for it. We do also sometimes get them to like say something in the video, just so that we can clearly see that every video is different and not somehow like a duplicate of the previous one. But yeah, that's mainly how we do it.
That's great. before Alex jumps in with more questions, there was also one, and I mentioned it at the beginning about funding, right? Given all this, I mean, that you found out that something was not working, or at least not working as you expected, how did the funders cope with that? With you changing strategies and redesigning the randomized control trial?
Yeah, great question. So I guess probably the first thing to say is we did all of this on a shoestring budget. And so often people are like, oh, RCTs are too expensive. And again, as is a bit more simple than some other RCTs, but it is kind of an example of like sometimes it can be done with limited funds. It worked to some degree. So the first bit of funding was a Keystone grant from Save Our Seas Foundation. And that funding was for sort of the design phase research. And then the final year of that grant was a bit of money to like try and set up a randomized control trial to sort of test if it worked. And so that was kind of, the money was for design and piloting and sort of providing evidence, a sort of a proof of concept. Since then, we've managed to just like piece together other little bits of money to keep it going and to expand the RCT a bit. And so then like the next big chunk of money has been from the UK government, from the Darwin Initiative, Biodiversity Challenge Funds, and they are focused on sort of biodiversity and wellbeing outcomes. They really like evidence and impact evaluation. And I guess we kind of got the perverse result somewhere in the middle of that funding. And they were like completely fine with it because we were just like very transparent. We were like, we've done this impact evaluation. Here's the results, some good, some bad. We're using this evidence to adapt our strategy. It was fine. But I was gutted at first. I mean, I'm in this kind of weird position when I'm both practitioner and researcher. And, you know, I had this dream. I've sort of designed this incentive program. I had this dream that we're going to have this lovely success story where we're going to be like, you know, simple solution, incentives deliver, biodiversity and wellbeing outcomes, sharks happy, fishes are happy. And then we got the sort of unexpected result, and I was like, no, what am I going to do? Like genuinely, like quite emotional. And you know, we're trying to have this cool, innovative NGO that's like doing really transparent, you know, impactful work, and we really want to pride ourselves on providing the best available evidence that our programs are working. But then it's really scary when you have to like tell a story of an unexpected result. And you know, I was worried. Obviously, I wanted the success story because it's so much easier to get headlines and funding when you've got just like and we could have lied. We could have just been like, look, you know, forget the experiment. Look at the number of releases. But that's just, you know, that would never be my style. So I admit it's very scary. Funders have generally been fine, and I think as long as you're transparent and talk about how you're adapting. Then and be like, okay, you know, it's not the end of the world. We're using this information to make things better, and here's how. It's been fine. We're still here.
Excellent.
We're still going. It hasn't all fallen apart. So yeah.
And again, related to that, do you think? I mean, somebody here, Alan Blackman, actually is asking. Again, based on implementation or related to implementation. Yeah, sorry, this is another topic. Did you also consider differentiating payments for hammerheads? Because you were doing this for wedge fish, right?
So we have payments for wedgefish and hammerheads, and they have different values. So sorry, I didn't actually explain that very well. But there were payments for both, so both can be released. And the payments are different values because they have different market values. The challenge is that hammerheads typically die. So hammerheads are ram ventilators; they need to swim to breathe, whereas wedgefish have spiracles, so they can still breathe when they're stuck in the net. And we kind of knew this, that wedgefish generally have higher survivability than hammerheads, but I just thought they're dying anyway in these nets. Let's incentivize the fishers and see if I can figure it out. And we've had way more hammerhead releases than I expected. I thought there would be just like zero. I didn't expect any, to be honest. I didn't expect any live releases of hammerheads, but there have been a bunch. But yeah, obviously we also had this unexpected effect. So that they can get compensated for later releasing hammerheads. It's really tricky for hammerheads. Like ideally, you would just avoid catching them in the first place, but because they have these weird shaped heads and they die really quickly, it's actually really hard to. They get caught in everything and then they die. So that's why the sort of the fish traps are a bit more of an effective measure for hammerheads because they avoid catching them in the first place.
Great. Maybe just the last question because we're running out of time. I must say there are many questions, very interesting questions you might imagine, Hollie. But so for everyone, you might, if you want, Hollie, be contacted later by anyone as you put up your contacts. And probably the one I find interesting as well, related again to funding. Do you expect sustained funding for this project in the future? And how do you see this kind of issue for other such projects?
Yeah, it's really tricky. So, the dream, I'm actually part of an incubator program at the moment with the Conservation Finance Alliance, trying to get sort of sustainable finance. And that's the dream, for all conservation programs, is some kind of sustainable revenue stream. And there are all these like hypothetical great ideas, like bycatch levies and tourism levies and, holding commercial companies accountable for their impact dependencies and that kind of thing. Biodiversity credits. We've also, I didn't talk about it, but we've actually started using baited remote underwater video systems, basically camera traps in the sea, to get baseline data on abundance and diversity of species, in the hope that we can use that for incentives for actual conservation outcomes in the water, so measured changes in abundance and diversity of species, and B, we might be able to one day leverage that to get sort of marine nature credits. But all this stuff is like very new and nobody really is ready to sort of put their money where their mouth is. And the challenge with an incentive program like this, pay to release, is you do have to keep paying to sustain it. So on the other hand, all conservation activities cost money. So if the alternative was, and I don't know if I made this clear, but hammerheads and wedgefish are not protected species in Indonesia, so it is completely legal to catch them. But if we did decide we were going to make it illegal, that we're going to be protected species, we'd still have to invest in enforcement and monitoring, which would also be expensive, and there'd also then be social costs to fishers, which would kind of add to the total social cost of doing that. So, it's tricky. Despite having ideas and the fact that, tourists that come to Aceh scuba diving, albeit in another part of Aceh, say they're willing to pay like $10 per person per trip towards community-based conservation, actually creating the mechanisms to make that happen and channel it into the NGO is very hard. So there's all this talk about, innovative financing and private sector financing. In my experience over the last couple of years, it's been very hard to actually get any of that money in, and we're still very much relying on philanthropy basically for now. But who knows? My hope is that there will be some options. Another option would be something like a trust fund where you just kind of have a big pot of money and then just use the interest, because it's very cheap. The incentives themselves are actually very, very cheap. So yeah, sorry, I'm kind of waffling, but I guess the short answer is we don't have a magic sustainable finance yet. We're still mainly relying on donor money. I have some ideas, but none of them have turned into anything yet.
All right. And with that, once again, thank you, Hollie. I will hand it over to Alan for a wrap-up. And yep.
Thank you so much, Hollie. That was really fascinating. I learned a ton. I just wanted to mention that our next seminar is February 3rd, 2026. and we'll have Jan Borner from Germany talking with us. And until then, we wish you all a very happy holiday and a happy new year. Thank you so much for joining us. Cheers.